everyone, and welcome to today's SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. I'm Katie Nichols. I'm an instructor for Forensics 578 Cyber Threat Intelligence at SANS, also Director of Intelligence Operations at Red Canary. Very excited you are all here today to talk about all of the threat things, because as always, there's a ton going on. I see we have Jeff on the line. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I know we get folks from around the world. Let's dive right in. We have a lot to talk about today. No guests, just me talking about all the threat things. Big news this week. I'm almost certain that you all probably saw it, but we're going to talk through it. Quackbot, also known as Qbot, malware disrupted in a pretty huge disruption operation. International cooperation for this one, right? The US Department of Justice kind of released this press release, and there's a ton of documents, a lot of information about this. We'll kind of walk through. And I wanted to hit this one. I want to spend a little time talking through it for a couple of reasons. First off, this is good news. Like, I don't know about you all, but there are a lot of threats out there. It can be really hard to track them all, defend against all of them. And so anytime as a community there is a takedown, like, I think it is time to stop and celebrate. So for anyone involved in this, and like almost certainly across public and private sector, folks from around the world, congratulations and thank you for taking down this massive botnet. So if you aren't familiar, Quackbot, also known as Qbot, that name resulted in the awesome code name for this operation, Operation Duck Hunt, which if you're like me and you played Nintendo years ago, you always think about the laughing dog with the duck hunt and those like orange guns that didn't work. But anyways, Operation Duck Hunt, massive takedown. If you've been around this field for a while, if you're a defender, you've almost certainly heard of Quackbot. I say Qbot because I'm lazy, but a little bit of background in this press release. Right, this has been one of the most annoying malware families. It's created a botnet over the past couple of years. And there's so many aspects to this story that I think are really interesting to think about. Like the first one is just thinking about law enforcement, how they prioritize all of the many malware families' cyber threats. And one thing that's important to note about Qbot is that they were known to partner with a bunch of different ransomware actors. Right? We know that, ransomware operations aren't straightforward, and it's often a different actor that gets on the box with something like Qbot malware, and then they pass off that initial access to someone else. So if you're not familiar with Qbot, it's still worth kind of reading up, understanding a little bit about this malware family, right? You see in the documents, legal documents, some of the ransomware groups that the Qbot was known to kind of be seen with. Conti, now kind of defunct. One that's been more recently active, Black Basta. And so in thinking about, how do you get on law enforcement's top threat list? Like partner with ransomware groups and cause a metric ton of damage, right? They seized about $9 million, seized 8.6, yeah, and extorted funds. Like, if you start reading through these documents, which we'll take a look at, Qbot and the affiliated ransomware operations had a huge, huge financial impact on companies around the world, organizations around the world. So kind of an awesome win. One of the really interesting things about this takedown, right? And there are different ways law enforcement can do takedowns. If you've tracked these over the years, right? Sometimes, the government will issue indictments and try to, put an indictment out, maybe actually arrest actors. In this case, right, the FBI, through legal means, you can actually read the search warrants, gained access to the Qbot infrastructure, gives you a sense of how widespread Qbot really was. Over 700,000 computers worldwide, right? 200,000 in the United States. And these are just the ones that were actively infected. Like, you all have probably done a ton of work to try to make sure organizations aren't infected with Qbot. I know my team has. And so these are just the ones that were still active. Like huge impact for this. And so what was kind of neat here, right? Rather than just being like, that sucks. There are hundreds of thousands of organizations who are still infected with Qbot. FBI redirected traffic and then ultimately pushed all of those Qbot victims a file that would uninstall the malware from the system. This is another really interesting aspect to this case, right? And if you look at law enforcement actions, and especially in cyberspace, there are a lot of debates out there. Like, should this be something that any law enforcement agency should be allowed to do? Right? This can be also risky. Like, almost certainly the FBI tested the file, the script that they pushed. But, for example, what if they messed up something in the script, they pushed it to hundreds of thousands of computers, and it accidentally deleted something else or uninstalled another application, right? There's a lot of risk and kind of interest there. So that's something that, there's a debate in the community, right? Is that the right thing to do? Is it not the right thing to do, right? Something for you to consider what you think about that approach. I will say in general, I am pro uninstalling malware from systems, right? So I think in general that it's a positive thing if law enforcement, regardless of what agency it is trying to help victims rather than just being like, we know about all of these victims and we're not going to do anything. So another cool thing, right? A lot of different partnerships here. The site Have I Been Pwned, right? Site from, I think his name's Troy Hunt, right? They shared a bunch of information there, so you can actually look up if you've been a Qbot victim, if information's been involved there. Lots, certainly private sector orgs. They called out Zscaler here, but lots of different public and private orgs coming together. So kind of cool. So if you haven't joined our live stream before, I just wanted to mention that this is just the latest in a very long series of indictments, of legal actions, of takedowns. So this is a spreadsheet that I started a couple years ago because I was having trouble keeping track of all of these. Luckily, I kind of fell off on this one, but my friend Andy Piazza, who helps me maintain this, also added this as just the latest example of a legal document that is really interesting to analysts. So I want to take a couple minutes to kind of walk through the findings here, because legal documents, whether it's an indictment or in this case search warrants, they're interesting from like the perspective of it's a takedown, right, disruption, but also interesting because there are certain tidbits about the actors, how they operate. And even though Qbot is disrupted, like we've seen in major disruptions like Emotet, TrickBot, others, that usually there's a significant decrease, but maybe that malware family doesn't go away. And you can bet that a lot of the actors are going to kind of go develop different malware or use those same tactics, techniques, and procedures. So these legal documents are a really valuable source for us as analysts to kind of look at and learn about adversary TTPs. So walk through some of the kind of interesting aspects here. So you can find all of these legal docs from this one main link here. And I'm going to pull a lot of them up, but they're all at the bottom here. So DOJ, U.S. Department of Justice, released this. One thing for anyone who is protecting an organization to look out for. Highly recommend whatever monitoring logging you have, go search for this SHA-256 hash value of the Qbot uninstaller. This is the file that the FBI actually sent right to Qbot victims. And you might be like, well, it's an uninstaller of malware. Why would I want to look for that? Well, first off, it's going to be helpful for you to know if you have that on your system. Like I imagine if there are any CISOs listening, like you want to know if the FBI pushed a script to uninstall malware, if that's anywhere. So just knowing that. But the other thing, and credit to Randy over at Proofpoint who tweeted this, and I was like, that's a great point. If you see this uninstall file, it means that that victim has been infected with Qbot. Chances are there could be some other malware or threat actor on that system because however, right, the Qbot malware got on that system, maybe it was an unpatched vulnerability, maybe a user that's happy clicking on phishing links, right? So I think anytime you see this uninstaller, if you see this in your environment, it's worth taking a closer look at that victim. See, are there any other signs? Can you hunt for any other signs of malware, anything else unusual? So I think it's worth taking some time to look at that. Right, at the bottom of this page, you can also see all of these juicy legal documents. I know, like, you might be like, you're such a nerd, but they are juicy. They're really, really interesting. So let's dive into a couple of these and take a look at some of the details, right? Again, these are search warrants for the uninstall file, for the server, and then the virtual currency. So in these search warrants, right, they have to provide a lot of background, right? So you'll get background if you're not familiar with Qbot, right? The ransomware groups they've cooperated with, the extent of victims, right? And so it's interesting. This also speaks to kind of the importance of public-private cooperation, right? So there are examples in this document of a company like Victim A, located in some locations redacted, was the victim of a Conti ransomware attack, right? Clearly, they let the FBI know, they investigated, right? And you can see details about, okay, they were demanding a ransom of $100,000, right? Okay, they actually deposited 48,000 to the actors. So this can give you a sense of the types of intrusions that, even if you're in private sector and you're like, man, I'm really sick of getting compromised by these adversaries, an example of how, potentially cooperation with law enforcement, whether that's FBI or another agency if you're in a different country, right? Maybe someday your anonymized company could end up in a document like this. So just kind of shows you the extent of a lot of these operations, right? Black Bossed, a particularly nasty ransomware group, ransom of about $3 million. Um, I know one thing I hear from a lot of threat analysts and defenders is it's tough to, you know, uh, try to document the value of having a CTI team or a defensive team. Looking at numbers like this, like I can tell you, a few security people, it's going to cost you less than 3 million. So something to think about in terms of the impact here. Right? You can also get knowledge of right how the Qbot infrastructure was set up, how the malware worked, and again, yes, Qbot's disrupted, but chances are other malware families are going to use a very similar type of setup, right? Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 servers. So lots of interesting details here. Again, maybe I'm nerdy, but I think it's really interesting. And what you'll find is some of this information, like it's been publicly known for a while. Qbot, tons of researchers have talked about it, but sometimes there's little tidbits in here we can look at that is maybe not publicly known yet. So a couple of other things to kind of hone in on. Yes, I know a lot of these details are redacted, government life, but talking a little bit about, again, the TTPs, right? So looking at the admin computers, right, related to that Qbot infrastructure. RDP was open. Anyone who's worked in defense for a while, like not shocking, adversaries love to use RDP, remote desktop protocol. So some details there. Other aspects, right? And you'll see that these are kind of written from the affidavits or the person who's writing this affidavit. So probably an FBI agent in this case, right, to their experience. One thing that stuck out to me, again, learning about how malware works. So cool, to avoid detections, cyber criminals commonly use cryptors. This is something that my team sees quite a bit. There are these cryptors, which can be either services or tools where, if I'm an adversary and I don't want my malware to be detected, I can use one of these cryptors. They often will advertise themselves as making your malware fully undetectable. Examples like Pure Cryptor is one, for example. And why this is relevant, if you've never heard of a cryptor, definitely worth looking into. One of the things my team has found is that these cryptors actually have a lot of repeatable patterns, right? That they'll use a certain command line or there's something you can look for. So it's kind of cool because adversaries are like, great, I'm going to use this cryptor to try to make sure you can't detect me. But then if you find a unique string that's unique to that cryptor, that actually helps you detect them. Kind of a fun way to turn things around. So Qbot using cryptors, right? Other details about the infrastructure here, right? What ports it's open on, what ports it's operating on. So, hey, again, maybe looking at logs, like, is this a port you've seen in any of your incidents recently? Is that open, right, in your infrastructure as well? So a couple others, let's remember if it's in this one or the next one. So one of the things that's important to think about with any malware family, whether it's Qbot or others, is that the malware has to get on the system somewhere. And one of the things that I'll talk about in a bit is the fact that Qbot malware is delivered by these affiliates. Proofpoint calls them TA570 and TA577. So if you tracked those affiliates in the Qbot malware, you'll know that they're different campaigns, right? These two different groups will deliver Qbots, and Qbot researchers over time started referring to these two groups that deliver Qbot as presidents and as letters. And you'll actually see the reason for that here, right? So in when an adversary is configuring their malware like Qbot, they can add an identifier. And as you're analyzing malware, it's actually a great thing to ask a malware analyst for, or a sandbox can pop this out, right? So Qbot malware in particular would have these specific IDs, right? TR01, 02, etc. And these actually can help researchers identify, oh, this is part of the TR campaign for Qbot from the affiliate known as Letters, which I think is 577. So kind of an interesting tidbit there. The other main affiliate that delivered Qbot was what analysts commonly called presidents, because the identifiers use the name of US presidents. So it would be like Obama 121, or Clinton, I think, was one of them as well. So kind of an interesting tidbit. Again, if you weren't familiar with Qbot, understanding how it works, because even if we don't see much Qbot in the future, understanding that there are these unique identifiers in the malware that can help us figure out a little bit about what that campaign is, that's really useful. A couple of folks on Twitter have been commenting on this. One thing, credit to Nick Carr over at Microsoft. He called out an interesting aspect of one of these warrants, right, which we'll dive into. So one of the things the FBI was able to gain access to was the actual Qbot infrastructure itself, right, the administrator's machines. And so they took a look at chats, right, between the actors. And they also found, interestingly, a directory containing a few files holding information about virtual currency wallets. A couple people laugh at this next part, right? One of the files, license.txt. A different file, payments.txt. What do you think payments.txt stands for? List of payments they've made or they've received. And a lot of people, if you haven't done incident response before, you might look at this and be like, this is ridiculous. An adversary would never name their payments information payments.txt. If you've ever done incident response before, you might be saying like, yeah, they do. They absolutely do. And the thing I always say is like, adversaries have to stay organized too. So, hey, I don't know if it helps, but payments.txt, maybe that's an interesting tidbit to pull away from this one. Other aspects, again, adversaries kind of staying organized. One thing that Nick Carr called out that I thought was pretty funny is that they actually, the adversaries had different subdirectories named clean and dirty, right? Just to help them kind of figure out, okay, is this funding source, right, the dirty source? Have I laundered it yet, or is it clean? Again, adversaries have to stay organized. So that's an example of the kind of thing that a lot of the time we're not going to get in normal threat research, cyber threat intelligence reporting, that you might get from one of these indictments, or in this case, a search warrant. So lots of interesting tidbits. I think it's really worth a read. Again, from that initial link that we shared, that Quackbot resources link, you can find links to all of these. So other aspects of this Qbot disruption to talk about, right? Whenever there's a disruption like this, often it's sort of make the actors have a bad day, but then also you'll see something, in this case, joint report from CISA and DOJ, focusing on defenders, right? Defenders, what should you be doing? And right, one thing to think about here, as I mentioned, is looking and seeing if you have that uninstaller file. And if so, think about that victim had Qbot in the past and might have additional malware. So this is more of a kind of defensive flavored report, thinking about, right, how could you prevent similar malware in the future? It's also an interesting time, if you weren't tracking Qbot infections across your environment, right, maybe going back and looking at some previous intrusions or incidents or tickets in your system, and then see, do any of these things match these TTPs from Qbot now that I know more about it? Also have your indicator list. I think they have this in a sticks file as well. if you don't want to copy and paste indicators out of a PDF, which I try to avoid whenever possible. All right, so defensive angle to this as well. Private sector folks have also done some reporting. So, of course, whenever the FBI sends an uninstaller file, that's going to be very interesting. So, folks at SecureWorks did a really nice little write up here about their analysis of that uninstall file. Right, this is the file that the FBI sent to Qbot victims. Talks about the shell code, what exactly that shell code does. Right, unpacking a custom DLL, and then how it terminates the Qbot processes and basically does that cleanup. So if I found a random uninstaller file on any of my machines, I would definitely want to know what it does. So this is a really nice way to kind of understand that. All right, so what? Other than celebrating, how else do we want to think about this? Well, one thing that I would really recommend thinking about is the fact that, yes, this is good news. Qbot disrupted. Hopefully, we'll see a lot less Qbot malware. But the reality is, a lot of these adversaries are probably just going to shift to different malware families. So I mentioned briefly a couple of the affiliates, right? The actor groups that actually delivered Qbot. The names for these from Proofpoint, one of them is TA577, right, described in this blog post. Then the other is TA570. So as we read a little bit from Proofpoint here about TA577, right, yes, TA577 was one of the most prolific deliverers of Qbot. However, you see here, that is not the only payload they've delivered. Also have delivered iced-ID, System BC, etc., all these other malware families. And so one assessment that Intel analysts are making right now is that it's likely that these groups are going to shift to different payloads. One way to think of this, I don't actually know who created this meme, but I think it's a really nice way to kind of think through this, right? Cool. So law enforcement did a takedown of Emotet, right? And then Quackbot. And then what's next? So a reasonable hypothesis is that some of these actors that were previously delivering Qbot might switch to another malware family like iced-ID. And so, right, if you're in law enforcement and you're watching, like maybe that would be an interesting one for you to keep an eye on. And so bringing this kind of full circle, there are so many aspects to this disruption, right? Taking a look at the uninstaller file, thinking about how you could investigate, see if your machine has been infected with Qbot. But I think the kind of policy angle and the kind of response to this is also interesting, right? It seems like these different malware families, as they start partnering with ransomware groups, they kind of get up priority in terms of law enforcement takedowns. And so thinking about which group is going to be next, which malware family is going to be next, iced-ID could be a possible future target of law enforcement. We'll see. And then, also thinking about broadly the strategy, right? This is one thing that, again, there's a whole lot of aspects to this, but thinking about why do we do these disruptions? Why does law enforcement do these disruptions? Well, yeah, a lot of people have malware uninstalled, but one approach and one perspective is that this might have a deterrent effect, right? If I'm the developer of iced-ID or I'm sending that payload, I might be kind of getting a little nervous looking at the Quackbot takedown, thinking about, is this something I really want to do? So a lot of debate in policy circles over whether actions like this have a long-term deterrent effect, something that there's active debate over. So again, I can't tell you what to think, but a lot of different aspects to think about with this Qbot takedown. So hopefully you all found that interesting. I think these documents are really fascinating. Definitely worth taking a read and really nerding out over those. All right, we'll spend a bunch of time on Qbot because that was the big news of the week, and I think it's really interesting. But that is not the only thing going on right now. As you might have heard jokingly, folks saying it's hot 0-day summer. We are right before the Labor Day weekend in the United States, late August, and the vulnerability exploitation has continued through the summer. So I wanted to highlight a couple vulnerability-related reports for you. This one has actually been ongoing for a little bit. Hopefully, if you have a Barracuda ESG appliance, you have heard about this one and you have taken action. This has been active, out there for a couple months now, But this was a great report from Mandiant on the group, right? The UNC 4841. I believe that they've affiliated this to likely Chinese actors. Um, China Nexus, right, is what they said. So this is the group that was actually exploiting this vulnerability in the Barracuda appliance. So this is a really interesting piece, again, because it talks about a lot of the TTPs that this group uses. And so even if, you've used a Barracuda appliance, maybe you've, made sure you're not vulnerable, interesting to think about the TTPs this group has used to try to protect in the future. One thing I really liked in this piece was a timeline. Love a good timeline, right? This is showing the in the dark blue the activity levels from this group and right the number of victims. Always interesting as you're doing kind of time-based analysis. This is something we talk about a lot in Forensics 578. Sometimes there'll be gaps. So, for example, right, the Mandiant analysts highlighted in January 2023, there was a little bit of a pause in activity towards the beginning of Chinese New Year. Now, we have to be cautious with this kind of analysis. We're not saying, like, oh, it's Chinese New Year and these actors were quiet, so it's definitely Chinese actors. No, that'd be like one piece of evidence in an attribution assessment. But also interesting to see gaps in like public notification about this vulnerability, right? When the patch was deployed. So interesting to look at these temporal patterns. So blog post from Mandiant, great kind of reference. As always, we want to think about, does this fall into my threat model, right? Do I even need to spend time looking at these TTPs? Right, towards the end of this piece, a lot of details about all of these different tactics and phases, right? You see in terms of targeting, a lot of targeting from this group of US-based entities, right? Mandiant analysts noting that's probably because that's where a lot of Barracuda appliances were located. But then in thinking about the organizations impacted by this group, right? If you are in government, IT, tech industry, telecom, manufacturing, right? Those are the organizations, even colleges and universities, where this group has shown interest. So always be thinking about, we have tons of reporting, which ones matter for me? If you're in any of these industries, this might be something to look through. Luckily, lots of technical detail to think about, all right, how could I protect against these TTPs? Because what we know, these groups, right, yes, we're focused on a Barracuda vulnerability this time, but we know that a lot of these groups will find new vulnerabilities in different perimeter appliances often, right? So don't just think, well, it's in this one appliance, this is remediated, thinking longer term about what these adversaries are doing. So that's one vulnerability related piece I'd recommend taking a look at. Another one, if you care about vulnerabilities, I'd say Rapid7, a great blog, a great team to follow. Right, this one talking about Cisco ASA appliances. Again, don't want to pick on any of these software vendors. Like software has vulnerabilities, that's the way they are. But we see a lot of different adversaries investigating these perimeter appliances, perimeter defense appliances. Some of the challenges that a lot of these don't have traditional endpoint monitoring, right? And so that makes them a particularly great foothold for adversaries to get into an environment. Okay, so thinking about these adversaries conducted credential stuffing attacks using weak or default passwords. We say it over and over, but enabling multi-factor authentication and strong passwords can protect against a lot of these exploits. Again, in thinking about threat modeling, does this actually affect my organization? This was one where the exploitation, no clear pattern amongst target organizations. Hit a lot of different organizations, different sectors, so probably more opportunistic. So this is another one. If you have a Cisco ASA, highly recommend taking a look at this report, making sure that you haven't been exploited. All right, y'all have been quiet in the comments, so audience participation time. So CISA put out this report a couple of weeks ago, and we played this game on my team, so I'll play it with you all if you're willing to participate. All right, so CISA put out this report of 2022 for last year. What were the top routinely exploited vulnerabilities? Do you all have any guesses in what software? Again, not picking on vendors, a lot of software. Any guesses of software that made this top routinely exploited vulnerabilities list? See if anyone wants to comment. I know on my team, if you start looking at patterns, you see reporting about adversaries exploiting the same kinds of software over and over. We got folks from all over the world today. This is awesome. We got Honduras, Guatemala. Anyone want to play the game? I'm just imagining you all playing locally. There we go. We got Chris saying exchange. Joshua, Solar Winds. Solar Winds, a good one. Was that 2022? Like, I can't even remember. The years all kind of merged together. Notepad. Oh, I like that one. That's a good guess. Cool. Someone's stripping wallpaper. I'm sorry. That's kind of a tedious task. Word, PDF. Yeah, any of the Microsoft Offices. Fortinet. Yeah, if we were looking at 2023, Move It. So maybe Move It will make next year's. Yeah, so a lot of good guesses here. Let's start looking. Oh, someone said Log4j. Windows. That's a fair guess as well. Let's take a look, see how you all did. And you can play this amongst your team if you want. So scrolling down, we got Fortinet. Again, not picking on any company, but we know this is where adversaries like to focus. I saw Microsoft Exchange. Yeah, Proxy Shell, right? That continued into 2022, right? Started in 2021, but I think what this report shows is like just because, like this Fortinet CVE was from 2018, still routinely exploited in 2022, and like I'm just guessing that it's probably still exploited today, right? Others, Manage Engine was a big one. Atlassian Confluence. Someone mentioned Log4j. Yeah, I remember that one. That one was a lot of fun. So it's a little bit of a trip down memory lane. So worth taking a look here. We like to focus, right? A lot of us were joking like hot 0-day summer. We focus on the 0 days, but the reality is that vulnerabilities that are right from 2018, 2019, 2021 are still likely being exploited by adversaries. So definitely worth taking a look. And the reality is that if adversaries are trying to find vulnerabilities in a lot of these same systems now, like these are still systems that you want to make sure you're monitoring, right? Thinking of how you can mitigate future exploitation. So thanks for playing along. Y'all did really well. I think you got majority of them. So that's another one taking a look at. I think I forgot to post the link because I was so excited about you all trying to guess the software. So we'll post that in as well. But in addition to the CISA Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog, KEV, I thought this was an interesting one to look at as well. All right, so we've talked about vulnerabilities. Got to talk about ransomware. So ransomware just continues to really suck. You might have seen in the news, different organizations. I know the University of Michigan was down, I think with suspected ransomware, right at the start of classes. You might have seen in early August, Riceta ransomware was associated with compromises of a bunch of different healthcare organizations. This was an interesting one because I hadn't, Riceta wasn't really on my radar as one of the, super active ransomware groups until, right, this targeting of healthcare orgs started to happen. So the high profile one from earlier this month was against Prospect Medical Holdings. So this is definitely one that if you are in the healthcare sector, high priority to take a look at. One of the interesting aspects from this ransomware group was some of the ties that analysts noted to another ransomware group known as Vice Society. Now, this is part of the challenge of tracking all of these ransomware groups. Right? I don't know about you, but there's a new one, it seems like every week. And I'm like, I don't know if I've never heard of them. What are their TTPs? We find a lot of commonalities suggesting maybe these actors are kind of working together. Maybe they're switching. Okay, I used to be under the banner Vice Society. Now I'm under the banner Riceta. So different analyses and different assessments you could make. But, right, there's some assessments out there, including this one from Checkpoint, that there is a lot of technical similarity. I will say that's actually a good thing for analysts, right? Again, these commonalities in how these ransomware groups operate, very, very similar TTPs across all of them. RDP, a lot of people joke it's ransomware deployment protocol. Not exactly, but RDP really, really commonly used in ransomware intrusions. A lot of these built-in binaries, right? PS exec, using NTDS util to create a dump to dump those credentials. So lots of details here. Again, Riceta, especially if you're in the healthcare sector, you probably already got questions about this one earlier this month, but highly recommend taking a look at Riceta, keeping an eye out for that ransomware group. We've had folks from the DFIR report on our live stream before. Would highly recommend checking out their latest report about a compromise leading to Nokoyawa ransomware, right? And one thing to call out here, we talked about QBots and how a lot of the actors that used to deliver QBots, one of their maybe likely next payloads to focus on is going to be iced ID malware. So this case started with an Excel macro, iced ID malware, and we know that the time to encryption, right, and depends on different ransomware actors, how quickly they operate. This was a rough one, right? Final ransomware 12 hours after the initial compromise. Kind of highlights the importance of 24/7 monitoring. If you see some of these ransomware precursors that I call them, right? Iced ID malware, if you see the reconnaissance commands, if you see something like Cobalt Strike being dropped, you might have minutes to hours before this becomes a full-blown ransomware case. So lots of good details as always in this DFIR report piece. What you'll start to see if you've looked at these, I think they actually had like a challenge on Twitter X now of name some of the discovery commands that the adversaries ran. These are the same ones that we see over and over. So again, bad news, ransomware actors continue to be rampant. Good news, these behaviors are very detectable. So another great kind of tactical reference if you want to try to prevent ransomware. Looking more holistically, this is a great report that I saw from analysts over at Recorded Future talking about some different ransomware trends. So this one's worth a look. I like to highlight different summaries, right? Every half year, quarterly reports, annual reports, because I think it helps us think about where do we need to be focusing as analysts and defenders, right? Are there things that maybe others have seen that we haven't? And so a couple of themes that the Recorded Future analysts highlighted here, right? Ransomware groups targeting Linux servers. One of the common targets that we know ransomware actors like to go after are VMware ESXi hypervisors, right? Controlling that virtual machine infrastructure. That one's tough because similar to what I said with a lot of those perimeter appliances, a lot of orgs don't have monitoring on ESXi. And they only find out about ransomware that's affecting those ESXi hypervisors when they see the results of it, right? Some kind of encryption. So thinking about, if you have Linux in your environment, which a lot of organizations have that in cloud infrastructure, right? Workflows that you have. Thinking about how you probably need to be monitoring that too. Can't just ignore it if it's not Windows. So a bunch of other themes here. And again, you'll see themes from what we've talked about previously with Barracuda, etc. Other themes here, we can't just look at the ransomware itself, right? I like that the Recorded Future analysts also talked about info stealer malware, which is often seen as a precursor to ransomware. Thinking about top ransomware families here, Lockbit, AlphaV, also known as Black Cat, has been pretty rampant lately. So always good to keep an eye on the top ransomware groups, thinking about, do we know their TTPs and especially their precursors? So other aspects here you can take a look at. Again, Linux targeting, if you have Linux in your infrastructure, might be something you want to take a look at. Another aspect I wanted to hone in on this report talks about is the increase in bring your own vulnerable driver attacks. So a lot of people are familiar with living off the land binaries, right? These are things like ipconfig built into Windows, or how about run DLL32, a common way to proxy code execution. Well, there are also drivers, right? That adversaries are starting to use legitimate vulnerable drivers to try to disguise evade antivirus, etc. So this is something that's really worth looking at and thinking about, right? The same way that we as a community have done a good job trying to detect malicious use of living off the land binaries, how do we try to detect use or abuse of these vulnerable drivers? So if you haven't started thinking about this, highly recommend checking out this project. This is called LOL Drivers, Living Off the Land Drivers, created by Mike Haig and a couple of other analysts. Right, this is a list of drivers that adversaries have abused to try to bypass those security controls. So, kind of a really neat project, definitely worth checking out if you aren't familiar with vulnerable drivers. Right, this is something we see adversaries increasingly taking advantage of. So again, thinking about, all right, from what Recorded Future or another team summarizes in their report, what kind of action can we drive? CTI analyst, here is what the adversaries are doing. They're abusing vulnerable drivers, and then passing something like LOL drivers to your defenders to think about how could we maybe incorporate this into our defenses. All right, that is our ransomware section. And then I have a bunch of other reports I want to hit fairly quickly since we're coming towards the end of our hour. One of them from Microsoft on the group Flax Typhoon. This is, I think last I checked, Typhoon. Yes, Typhoon is the China-based actors. I'm still getting used to the new weather names that Microsoft deployed a couple months ago. So this group, specifically this campaign that this blog discusses, talks about targeting of Taiwanese organizations. But again, in thinking about, should someone else care about this organization or this group rather, right? We see in the past, Flax Typhoon hasn't just hit organizations in Taiwan, they've hit orgs in Southeast Asia, North America, Africa, right? The types of organizations that they've hit, like government agencies, education, manufacturing. So if you're any of those sectors, this might be a group that's worth taking a look at. So for any report like this, I always look for the good news. The good news is, kind of like I talked about with the ransomware actors, a lot of very similar TTPs, similar tools, right? The China Chopper web shell that's been around for how many years? This group uses that. Mimikatz, super common credential dumping tool. He used that, as well as a bunch of living off the land techniques. So I'm always a big fan of Microsoft graphics, the simple breakdown across all of these tactics. What are the techniques adversaries are using? And as always, Microsoft blogs, if you're trying to figure out how do I detect this, scroll to the end. Right? They've got indicators, they've got hashes, right? Also details about some of the procedures. These are specific queries that you could use if you're using Microsoft Defender, but you can convert these same queries to whatever tool you're using, right? You can search for these same IPs, looking for a specific VPN bridge launched by a SQL Server process. So you can convert these queries to whatever types of query language, whatever types of logs you're using. All right, other random things. Rapid7, a mid-year threat review report. Again, I really like these partial year, half-year reports as a way to see what are other people seeing, what should I be paying attention to. And this is one where I dropped the link to the, it's there. There's a registration page. Want to be respectful to the researchers who produced this. So I'm not going to share the PDF link directly, but you can register and get a copy of this one. So Rapid7 does a lot with vulnerabilities, incident response, ransomware, etc. So as always, scrolling through, thinking about what are you most interested in thinking about for your organization. We see, cool, a lot of these same vulnerabilities, similar products that we saw in the earlier vulnerability list that we talked about. Worth taking a look at those if you have any of those products. Incident response trends. Never hurts to think about what initial access vectors your adversary is using. 39% remote access, often just adversaries cracking a password. This is where multi-factor authentication comes in as really a key defensive mechanism. So lots of great trends here, right? Other initial access vectors we see really commonly. A lot of orgs see this. Adversaries can very easily get into cloud environments from misconfigurations, not setting that up properly, right? Allowing connections in over certain ports, not setting up a password at all. Another initial access vector that is worth paying attention to: SEO poisoning, search engine optimization poisoning. I think we've talked about this in previous months, but a lot of malware right now is getting in via search engine optimization, where adversaries are basically using similar techniques that marketers use to get their results to the top of those search engine results. So if I search for some chat GPT software, right? I search and I'm like, oh, cool, let me download this chat GPT software. Turns out that's some kind of malware. So looking out for search engine optimization, this is a tough one to protect against, but highly recommend at least trying to educate your users that this is a vector. I will say, based on my knowledge of how widespread this is, like I hesitate to search for anything in a search engine, and I'm really careful with those results. Is this the real site, or is this masquerading, trying to get me to download malware? So another great kind of mid-year review report from Rapid7 worth taking a look at, again, thinking if there are things they're seeing that you should be paying attention to as well. A couple other interesting links that I wanted to highlight, right? So you might have heard about the Cyber Safety Review Board. This is an org stood up around CISA to examine, right, significant incidents, events, campaigns, and actors that have had a really widespread impact. So this report came out a couple weeks ago about the Lapsus group. Now, you might have seen, if you watched the news, that some actors were actually arrested recently associated with this Lapsus group. I believe they were based in the UK. And so you might be thinking, well, all right, if those actors were arrested, like, why do I care about reading this report? Well, the reality is that even if that group Lapsus under that name has kind of broken up, again, the same theme we've talked about today, a lot of those TTPs are being used by other groups, right? For example, Scattered Spider or other actors that are similar. So you can read the backgrounds, right? I wanted to hone in on a couple of specific TTPs that I'd recommend paying attention to. One of them, for gaining initial access. This is something that is becoming more and more common: SIM swapping. Social engineering as well. So SIM swapping, if you aren't familiar, basically the attacker kind of figures out a way to, for example, trick a telecom provider. Maybe they call them up. They say, hey, I'm Katie Nichols and I lost my cell phone. Can you switch my SIM to this new number for me? And if they have collected information about me, maybe they can be successful. And basically, they have control of SMS messages, maybe MFA messages, etc., if they can do that SIM swap successfully. So again, Lapsus, has broken up, but this is an example of a technique that adversaries are still using. Can be really tough to try to detect this, but this is again where maybe user awareness comes in. Thinking about, hey, if your users see a weird message on their cell phone saying like, your service has been transferred, letting the SOC know immediately, right? This is also something where telecom companies are working on this problem as well. So Lapsus report, 59 pages, a lot there, but just one example of a highlighted TTP, in this example, a technique and a procedure, doing SIM swapping. Couple other reports. AI. I was so happy to see this report from Mandiant. I know AI is a hot topic right now. Like, we should all be looking at AI, how it can make our lives easier. I saw something this week that they're investigating AI that can attend meetings for you, which talk about changing my life. If I could not have to go to meetings and just have AI say what Katie would say, that'd be great. But something that a lot of analysts have started, thinking about, asking about is, are adversaries using AI, right? And we automatically go to this really scary scenario of adversaries are using AI to make super advanced malware and figure out how to exploit us. So I really like this report from Mandiant because, right, the takeaway is yes, adversaries are looking into AI. However, not super widespread right now. Personally, in all of the like realm of threats and things to be concerned about, I see AI as something like absolutely keep an eye on it. But one thing that I argue is if adversaries are using AI and large language models to try to figure out how to create malware or TTPs to use, if they're bringing in right resources that already exist, if they're saying like, oh, go look at GitHub and all the existing malware, the good news is that likely whatever AI tool is going to generate is going to be really similar to what's already out there. So if you can detect things that are already out there, I would argue that's a great way to detect against AI generated malware. So worth thinking about. Again, it's worth thinking about how AI can kind of improve our lives, make analysts' workflow better. But I would say we probably don't need to freak out and panic that like the sky is falling right now in terms of adversaries creating like undetectable malware with AI. So worth a read thinking about AI, how your org uses it. As I mentioned, like one common AI challenge right now is that everyone's curious about it. So they search for Chat GPT. Adversaries know that everyone's searching for that in search engines. And so, cool. They use search engine optimization and then send you a stealer, right? Based on that Chat GPT search term. So, AI is something to continue keeping an eye out. Another aspect to keep an eye out. You might have seen this announcement. I'm a big fan of Excel. Love me some Microsoft Excel. Right? We would argue that spreadsheets one of the best tools for CTI analysts, but not super happy to hear that the Python language is going to be combined into Excel. When this came out, like many defenders, myself included, were like, awesome. How are adversaries going to exploit this? Like, great, they can just run their Python code in an Excel doc. Awesome. So this is something, I don't know that I've seen reports of adversaries using this yet, but something to kind of keep an eye out for adversaries embedding Python in an Excel file. Our work is never done. All right, we're coming up towards the end of the hour. We have covered a ton. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of upcoming events. So September is almost here. There are tons of conferences in September and October. I just wanted to highlight a couple that I think are really interesting to Intel analysts. Cyber WarCon, this is an awesome one led by John Holtquist. This is very low cost virtually, and you also get some like cool socks usually. So this one focuses on cyber war, a lot of disinformation, and a lot of advanced persistent threat actors. So they're in person and virtual. Another one that I will actually be facilitating a panel at, MITRE Attack Con. So if you're a fan of MITRE Attack, this might be one to tune into. There's in person and then totally free online. So virtual registration opening later in September, but this is a good one to get on your calendar. Not just focus on MITRE Attack, but there's a lot of threat briefings there talking about how organizations actually use MITRE Attack. So that's another one in the fall to kind of, I would say, save the date for that I will be attending myself. Tons of SANS events coming up as well. The SANS OSINT summits. And we know OSINT, very complementary field of cyber threat intelligence. So highly recommend this one. The SANS OSINT summit coming up September 22nd. Totally free online. So register for that one. And then, of course, I'm biased, but one of my favorite events of the year, the SANS CTI Summit. We are already starting planning for that. It's going to be January 2024, but our call for presentations is open now. So a lot of you know a lot about threats. If you have something to share, we are looking for all kinds of presentations, right? If you have a case study, if you have an interesting cyber threat intelligence application, I'm always a sucker for talks that talk about like taking lessons from another field like real estate and applying it to intelligence, right? How have you operationalized intelligence? How do we measure intelligence? Any of those areas, we would absolutely love to see your proposal. You don't have to be an experienced speaker, right? We assign mentors. So I would really encourage, if you've ever been like, oh, I'm nervous, but I'd really love to speak, throw your proposal in. We would love to take a look at it. If you get accepted, we will assign you a mentor from our board to help you kind of craft your slides, make sure you have an awesome presentation and a great experience. So SANS CTI Summit. It's going to be, I think it's January 29th, 2024. You can mark your calendars, but definitely would love to see proposals from any of you. Whew. All right. That was a lot, y'all. That's all I have for today. Hope to see you at a future STAR live stream. Until then, I'm Katie Nichols. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.